After e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6 and bishop c4, the Italian game is on the board. We go on with f5. So in the previous videos we went through pawn takes in f5, which is a blunder basically, d4, which is the main move. In this video we're going to go through the solid d3, how to continue. Knight f6, putting more pressure over the e4. And now there's 4 replies we're going to go through. One of them is bishop to g5. So let's start with bishop g5. We attack the bishop immediately. And now the bishop cannot keep the pin. So we are going to be able to take the pawn in e4 and put a lot of pressure unless white wants to take. Because going back with the bishop wouldn't make sense. So after, well, yeah, white can choose to do that. Bishop e3, for example. But you have a lot of pressure over e4. And you should be able to take this pawn at some point. So after bishop goes back to h4, the pin cannot be kept because g5, bishop g3, f4. So that's very obvious. The bishop is trapped. So after h6, bishop takes, queen takes back. And now after knight to c3 developing, threatening to go to d5, attacking the queen and attacking the square c7, causing the black player to play a few retreating move. Black immediately plays bishop b4, pinning the knight with the idea of taking it. So for example, castle is met by simply take the knight. The knight is no longer pinned, so you gotta take it before it jumps to d5. Pawn takes back. Now we play the game on this weakness that we have permanently created. Pawn takes, and this doubled up and isolated pawn is what we're going to be playing on. So d6 comes now, and now there's 2 ideas. Considering that obviously what we want to do is bishop g4, rook f8, and damage also the square f3 with the pawn structure as well. Also we want to start pushing pawns on the king side and castle queen side. That's what we're going to do. So there's 2 options we're going to be looking at, and then we're going to go to the next line. One of them is the thematic queen d5, whereas the other one is h3 to stop all of that. Okay, so let's start from queen d5. Black continues with knight to e7, attacking the queen. The queen has no useful checks, so the queen will have to go. After queen b5 check, the only move that keeps the attack going on, because otherwise the white player will have to admit wasting tempos, whereas our knight has not been wasted tempo, because this is a e4 e5 game, and the knight from c6 didn't have any future anyway, so we had to go to e7 because we want to play knight g6, knight f4, putting pressure on 2 very crucial squares near the opponent king. So after queen b5 check, we attack the queen once again. There's nowhere to go with the queen except b3. That's the only place where it makes sense, keeping the pressure, the attack. However, it's completely useless, as you might notice. Black continues with b5. There's no problem at all. We are now kicking away the bishop, and it looks like though we won't be able to castle anywhere safe. But we don't need to do it for the moment. You'll see why in a second. After the bishop goes back to e2, well, d3 will be completely stuck behind this pawn. So black continues with knight to g6. And now 2 options we're just going to quickly look at, because we're a bit far. We're move 14 at the moment. And what matters the most is we understand the plan. So, okay, the plans have been mentioned. Create this permanent weakness. Understand that the bishop g5 attacking the knight is not a problem at all. Understand you can trap it unless he has to swap. And so all the pressure on the pawn in e4 that you're putting since the very beginning, thanks to the f5 move and the knight f6 move, you might not win the pawn in e4 if the bishop goes to g5 pinning your knight, but you are going to create this weakness and you're going to be exploiting this e4 e5 game by playing knight e7, knight g6. So that's the plan, and then knight f4. So having mentioned this, let's look at 2 quick options. One of them is c4, which is there to try and attack this pawn in b5 with a lot of different pieces. We ignore it, we play knight f4, attacking the bishop. The bishop now goes to d3, and now it's just too late because bishop to h3 can happen. We have double attack over the pawn in g2. Then we're going to be threatening queen g6 with this cover check, so it's going to be a fantastic position. What happens if white simply takes? Well, if white doesn't take and pushes the pawn, I mean, you've got the exchange. You also can swap the knight for the bishop first and then just go up material. If white takes the pawn in the bishop in h3, queen check, and it's going to be checkmate next move. So in this position, instead of c4, if white plays g3, stopping the knight from going to f4, seems to be very logical. Bishop h3 attacking the rook, and after rook to d1, putting pressure on this backward pawn and also saving the rook. We're going to play knight f4 anyway with an attack on this bishop, and of course the pawn cannot take the knight because queen g6 equally gives checkmate next move. So after bishop goes back to f1, guarding this very dangerous diagonal in front of his own king. Black continues with bishop to g4, threatening to take the knight and place the bishop in an excellent square. Taking the knight is completely wrong, obviously, because you're opening up the king and you're going to lose a piece as well. So you're not really winning material even. So after knight e1, which is the best move by white, you can take the rook, and after rook takes back, knight goes back to g6, and that's how black gets to win this endgame. Queen to b4 could seem like an interesting idea, putting more pressure over d6, but simply castle. And now white doesn't have access to the d6 square because the queen is in cooperation with the rook attacking f2. So after f4, we take the pawn, and after rook takes in d6, with an attack on the queen, queen to g5, black is completely winning. You've got the two rooks, white is down the exchange, you also have more pawns. So we're going to close the line here and go to the next one. So in this position, earlier we went through queen d5. What happens after h3, stopping the whole bishop g4 idea, potentially? Okay, black continues with rook to f8. And the idea now is to take the pawn in h3, sacrifice, and after the pawn takes back, you've got two pieces attacking the knight. You're up a pawn, and also you're opening up the opponent king. King moving away like king to h2 to protect the pawn doesn't work because of queen check. The pawn cannot block because you got a free knight. And so the king will have to go back, and that will allow the black player to do exactly what we said, bishop h3. This will happen also if white were to play king h1. So what happens after bishop to e2, putting more defense over the knight. This is the most solid move. Black now plays king to e7. We give up the idea of castling because all we need to do is connect the rooks. Besides, all of these pawns here are offering quite safe protection to our king. So let's look at this idea, knight to d2, in order to push f4. Black continues with queen to g5, still threatening to take in h3. And also now it's the rook that is also attacking f4, not just the queen, meaning that f4 now will come with the attack of the rook and the pawn before our queen, so we don't have to worry about anything. Knight to f3 attacking a queen, queen to g6. So we reached the g file before, that's what we wanted. If white really plays knight to f3 to attack the queen again, then white has to admit he wasted some tempo, so the queen is just on the same file as the king. Let's have a look at this setup. Rook to b1, attacking the pawn, stopping the development of the bishop, is met with rook to b8. The reason is we don't really want to develop the bishop from the fianchetto in such a game. This bishop is much more useful like this, but I'm not saying that the bishop in fianchetto would be bad, not at all. But that's how it ideally will be developed. Let's go on a few moves before we move on to the following line. Queen to d3, developing the queen, connecting the rooks. And now rook to f4 is the best move by black. We want to connect the rooks and double them up. Knight to d2 can happen now because you're not really attacking the pawn in h3 anymore since the queen is protecting it. So black goes on with b6, and after king to h2, queen to f7, putting pressure on the pawn in f2. This is thematic. So after queen to e3, protecting that pawn a little bit further, black continues with g5. We don't have to worry about the rook being attacked because we can always go to f6. And what we will do is open these files. So the idea of king to h2 to get the rooks on potentially useful file isn't really working. Let's make an example. g3, okay, bring the rook back to f6. And there's nothing now. The bishop can't go to g4, would be happily swapped. Going to h5 will be taken by the queen. d3 is a useless square to go to in the Italian game, especially in such condition. There's nowhere else where it makes sense to go to. The knight can just jump away if it's being attacked. The knight is happy to do this jump, for example. This rook is useless. This knight doesn't have a future. And f4 cannot be played because you can take, and then take back with the rook. You're going up a pawn. So white doesn't really have any move right now. So from the start, after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, f5, d3, knight f6, and let's look once again at the variation bishop g5. We attack it immediately. Bishop takes, queen takes, knight to c3 gets pinned and taken soon. Earlier we went through castle. What happens when the pawn takes in f5? This is an annoying variation also because later on they might play g4, protecting the pawn, castle alongside maybe. But to be honest, it's not like that great. Black plays knight a5 straight away, and now this bishop will no longer be effective because we are going to take it. Bishop to b3, the best thing that white can do, because then after take and then take back, the rook is on an open file. But we also solved the problem of the king castling the other way around. Taking with the c pawn would have been terrible because of the d pawn isolated, the f pawn doubled up, and a future target. Not only that, now the game gets just easier because after castle, now we take the knight. Always remember that pattern. Pawn takes back, and now queen takes in f5. Black has got the initiative and a better pawn structure. And the idea is basically the same, d6, you can move the queen around to g6 after the pawn in e5 is supported, bishop g4, bishop h3, depends. Black is just doing better. This idea d4 is punished with e4, so the knight will have to move. After knight to e5, d6, the knight will have to move once again. g4 is not accessible because there's double attack on it. So after knight to c4, queen to g6, very similar plans. This is very smooth. Let's look at this idea now. King to h1, stopping the whole bishop h3 idea. Black plays a6 in order not to worry about the rook going to a7 and taking the pawn. So we are now able to develop the bishop and the rook without concern. After knight to e3, improving the position of the knight, maybe reaching d5. Black continues with the thematic rook to f4. We are going to double up the rooks anyway. After queen to e2, these are all best moves, but still black is going to be doing better. Bishop e6. Now here the main idea is to play, well, for the endgame, white has been playing engine moves, the best possible moves to defend himself in this faulty variation, and you get as many ideas as possible. Rook to g1 now, for example. This is thematic. You're applying pressure on f2, and f pawn can never really move without big repercussions, meaning you're going to isolate this h pawn, and the f pawn as well. The king is opening up. So you're going to be applying pressure on f2, and playing g3 was a positional mistake. You can play rook to f3. You can also play bishop h3 at some point. Black now goes on with rook a to f8 to apply more pressure over this pawn. So let's say, for example, f3, you just take, and after pawn takes back, there's an attack on the queen, but you just play queen to f7, and there's nothing to do to protect that pawn in f3. In this position, we went through rook g1, rook to a5, which is the best move according to the engine. Rook a to f8 once again attacking, putting more pressure over f2, and black has an idea of pushing the pawn. So after queen to d2, best move, also because think about it, there's nothing else to do. h5, obviously we want to go and create weaknesses with the pawn. A move like j3 is met with rook f3. Later on you're going to be playing bishop h3. You couldn't play it straight away because of the attack on the rook. And yeah, you might think bishop h3, if pawn takes the rook, then you have queen g2, but it's not checkmate because the knight is protecting, in case you didn't notice that. Well, now you do know. So in this position, after c4, queen to f7, finalizing the pressure over the f2 square. King to g1, defending it a little bit more. h4, right? We're going to keep pushing that pawn because in this game, there's basically nothing that can happen. It's like it's not even close, but you have bishop, white has knight, but the squares where the white pieces are placed is just weird. h3 now, stopping the arrival of the pawn. Either way, black plays queen to g6 once again because now we have an attack on h3. And after king to h2, it's just too late. Black pieces are placed too good. Bishop takes happens no matter what. We have the crucial support of the pawn attacking g3, meaning that if white takes with the pawn, rook sacrifice, we have access to g3, right? So after this check, there's also an attack on the queen, so white will have to take. And now queen check, only move will be king h1. And now rook to f2 with an attack on the queen and the threat of checkmate. In this position, remember also, even if white had taken with the king, same thing, you can just take. The access to the square g3 now is even more important because you've got a checkmate threat, literally. Last but not least, let's look at this idea. In this position, we went through rook a5 or rook g1. What happens after d5 attacking the bishop? We simply move the bishop back. And the goal here is to understand how to take this endgame. This is not the sharpest and most exciting video I've ever made. I'm aware of that, but that's because this is we're playing the Rousseau Gambit, but white played d3, which is kind of the Gioco piano type of variation. And it's the slow game. It's the very boring and solid. So we're gonna have to play a more mechanical endgame. But we get the ideas. The idea is that now white pieces are weird and they have no access to attack. They cannot attack. c4 now it's all about wasting tempos. Queen to g5 comes. This is the best move. And we're just waiting tempos and waiting for white to expose himself in any way. Meantime, we're not actually wasting tempos because we are trying to create some sort of Zugzwang. So for example, the white pieces are now protecting f2 very well. We are willing to play rook to f8, and we have to mess around a bit if we want white to play any other move so that we can finalize the attack. So let's say, for example, rook to g1. Okay, now you can play rook a to f8. And now white will have to go back and forth, but we are improving the position of our pieces. If rook a to f1, considering that this rook has no access, no meaningful access from the a file, black plays a5. So you see, white can't move a thing without going to huge trouble. b4 gets taken, the knight can't go anywhere, this rook can't move, the king can't move. All of these pawns being pushed will just lead to massive weaknesses and infiltration of our pieces. You'll see that in a second. c3, for example, wasting another tempo. What happens? Okay, queen e5, putting pressure on it, and this really makes it clear of how better the black pieces are placed. Queen d2 defending the pawn, and now rook to h4, threatening checkmate. This cannot be stopped anymore, so black was going to win material no matter what. h3 is silly, you've got the bishop sacrifice available, and you've got mate to follow. g3 also you got mate because of rook check, and then king takes, queen check, and then you've got the infiltration of the queen. Okay, so from the start, bishop c4 and then f5, d3. Okay, knight f6. We went through bishop g5. So what happens if white tries this fried lever type of attack? This is important to analyze as it can arise from many different type of positions, but you also have to always realize that this is never supposed to be good, but you have to know what to do. Black plays d5 immediately, like in the proper fried lever attack. And after pawn takes back, knight to a5. So all very thematic, we all know this. The bishop will have to move. If the bishop goes to b3, you just take it, obviously. Pawn takes back, the rook is on an open file now, but you're going to play bishop to d6. The attack is neutralized. White has just given up the bishop pair for nothing, and now you know that. After castle, rook to e1, rook to e8, knight to c3, developing all the pieces. Black plays h6 finally, the knight has to go. We have neutralized this fried lever in this specific scenario. We go on with b6. Best place to put the bishop will be the fianchetto, basically because white didn't take the pawn in f5, so we don't really have much of a future from this diagonal. But in any way, it's not like it was going to be a mistake if you try to develop this way. So two options now, and then we're going to close this line because it's a failure of a line. Knight to b5 is met by knight takes in d5. Don't worry, feel free to give up the bishop pair because that free pawn is important. If they take you can take back, you've got an attack on e5. If c4 attacking the knight, knight to b4 creates this weakness on d3. It's a backwards pawn, and the knight is never going to leave. Bishop d2 attacking the knight, probably to get rid of the knight. Bishop takes back, and now then there's going to be double attack of the pawn in e5. This doesn't work because you can just take in d3 with the double attack on the rook and the pawn, so it's going to be much better for black, of course. If white plays queen to e2, putting more pressure over d5, and the idea of swapping this knight and finally make pressure over e5, this doesn't work either because bishop to b7 is a very, very strong bishop. And now bishop to d2, trying to take that powerful knight. We're going to have to take the bishop so that white will have more access over e5. Well, then simply knight to c2, right? So that bishop is just a problem for the white player. In this position, we went through knight b5. What happens after knight to d2? How do we take it? Okay, queen to d7 comes now, developing the queen, and also after the fianchetto happens, you're going to be able to connect the rooks. After knight to c4, putting pressure over e5 from this square. But anyway, black plays b5, attacking the knight. We really don't like the knight there. It's too strong. So let's look at this idea. Knight takes in d6. Here we take with the pawn to give more support to the e5 pawn. We're going to be fianchettoing the bishop, and this will be a weak pawn. A move like d4 is met by the thematic e4. So we don't allow the opponent to develop the queen. And after knight to e2, you might wonder, what about knight f4, maybe bishop f4? Are these good ideas? Maybe the knight looks good in e4, maybe can go to e6 for whatever reason. Bishop to b7 comes now, you're going to be targeting this square. and after c4 defending the pawn, the rook moves to c8, applying more pressure over the c file. And now let's just close this line by showing knight to f4, for example, is met by pawn takes, rook takes, and now there's absolutely nothing for white. We're also going to be taking this pawn very soon. Bishop to e3, developing the best move here, but we're going to close the line, is a5. The reason is very simple and very deep. You do want to take this pawn in a5, but you also need to stop the rook from going to a5, because see, if you play knight takes now, the best move by white would be rook a5, putting more pressure over this file and forcing you to swap pieces, whilst white does have some initiative, some compensation. So here you play a5, and now you're threatening to take in d5. From the start, bishop c4 and then f5, d3, knight f6. So we saw bishop g5 and knight g5 moves. We're going to look at two other ideas. One of them is knight to c3 immediately. So just in case you didn't understand it yet, you have to play this move, because the future knight d5 move will be too annoying to meet, and also because you are putting pressure over e4. That's the whole point of playing the Rousseau Gambit, right? You want to conquer that square, and this knight is the defender of that square, so you want to take it. Okay, there's two ideas here. One of them is, for example, castle. Okay, looks very not natural. Okay, now we can take this pawn, and it looks weird because we are giving white the possibility to actually take in e4 with the knight, and no longer having the problem of breaking the pawn structure and so on. So why did we do this? Of course, because this is a fork. So in this case, the attack on the knight was not yet provoked. d5 is a fork. You might wonder, okay, well, white doesn't have to lose a piece because he can take knight f6 with check. Pawn takes back. The attack on the bishop remains. The bishop will have to move. And now bishop to g4, pinning the knight. The other knight is gone, so it will not be able to offer protection to the knight. Also, this bishop cannot go to the square e2 to offer more protection to the knight, which means we have created an unbearably annoying pin for our opponent, and we're willing to play rook g8 at some point. We'll see what happens. h3, for instance, of course, we move back and we keep the pin. A move like bishop to e3, developing the bishop, for instance, is met with f5 to give the possibility to the black queen, to the black bishop to go to this diagonal, play rook g8, castle long. Black is completely winning already. So for example, c3 attacking the bishop. Okay, bishop to e7. So here the plan is, if black were to play again, queen to d6, keeping an eye on the pawn in e5. Long castle. Position is evaluated as if black was almost up a piece. White pieces are placed in a very ineffective way. In this position, bear in mind that you might wonder, okay, g4, getting rid of the annoying pin. This is met with rook to g8. And white has created a long-term weakness. Black is willing to play f5, for example, in this position and double the attack on the g4 pawn. King h2, unpinning, and simply bishop f7. But the king side is compromised. h5 could be an idea here, obviously. Black's position is much better. So let's move on. So in this position, here we are. White player just played knight c3 after d3, and we went to immediately pin the knight. Bishop b4, and we went through white castling. What happens after the fried liver idea now? This now changes things a little bit. Black's best move is queen to e7, and after bishop to f7 check, king to f8 is important. You don't want to go to d8 because the bishop can just retreat all the way back. The knight f7 threat remains. So anyway, after bishop to b3, obviously because if you attack the knight will have to go away, and then the bishop is free to be taken. So after bishop to b3, f4 now, blocking the arrival of this bishop. And after white castles, bishop goes back to a5. The idea is to go into this very good square. After knight to d5 though, what happens? In this position, we didn't take the knight in c3. Why? Because after pawn takes back and then pawn takes back, white could have taken back with the knight. I mean, white has more pressure because he made this type of fried liver system. We take the knight here. And of course the bishop cannot take back because queen takes knight for free. So after pawn takes back with an attack on our knight, queen still takes this knight, gives up the knight in c6, but our king might be slightly misplaced, but at least we have the initiative. Black takes back obviously with the d pawn so that we can play the bishop into the game. After d4, bishop to g4. d4 is a strong move, but bishop to g4 attacks the queen, and all of these squares are attacked by the incredible white bishops. So after f3 blocking, bishop to h3, threatening checkmate, will the white player see it? Well, yeah, of course. Queen e2, and now rook to e8. That's how we're going to be castling. It looks like the black king is kind of in trouble because we can't play this pawn, but you'll see what happens now. After king to h1, getting rid of the pin and now threatening to take the bishop, black takes the pawn with an attack on the queen. Queen to f2, the threats remain, and now d3, dismantling the pawn structure and ignoring the bishop. So let's look at this fantastic line. Pawn takes bishop, we've done a piece, but now rook e2, and this is incredible. Queen will have to move, but whatever the queen moves, we will be threatening queen g2 checkmate. So after queen to g1, queen takes, king takes, but either way you're going to play d2, so you're winning a piece. You're winning the piece back. And now you won't need to castle. Well, you can't castle anymore, but look, after this move, after taking, so for example, if the king goes to h1 once again, king to e7, that's how you're going to be developing the other rook. Rook to g1, targeting the pawn. Okay, now finally you are provoked enough to take. Rook takes back, and I can play b6, g6 to stop the arrival of the rook. This is white having played the absolute best moves in this position, in a faulty line basically, and still black is better. It's a boring game, this d3 variation of the Italian, but you have to know what to do with it. By the way, before we go on to the following line, I'm going to bring you back to the fried liver attack in the variation where neither bishop g5 nor knight c3 were played, but rather knight g5 immediately. Okay, we said d5, pawn takes, and then the thematic knight a5, and then we mentioned bishop b3. What happens after the more theoretical bishop to b5? We have to see this move. Okay, we attack the bishop immediately, and after pawn takes, we have a pawn disadvantage where we're going to take back. We have now an isolated pawn, and we also down a pawn, but we have completely neutralized the attack, and now the white player has given up quite a few tempos, and we have a much more smooth development choices and ideas. Look how more smoothly our pieces can move. So if the bishop goes back to c4, you just take it. And after pawn takes back, queen to c7, castle, h6, kicking the knight away. The knight has to go back, e4. After the knight goes to d4, bishop to c5. The bishop is in the best possible diagonal. c3, protecting the knight a little bit further, bishop to d6. And now we have a lot of attack over h2. So after h3, we castle, the white bishop is neutralized and we're happy to castle. Black is dominant here. Knight to d2, improving the position of the knight, obviously developing the knight, you want to be able to go somewhere. Black plays a5, and after a4, stopping the arrival of the pawn, because the pawn was going to prevent knight from being able to develop to the only square where he could go to. Rook to e8, then after knight b3, f4. I think we all know where this is going. After c5, attacking the bishop, how to respond to this? Bishop e5, simply stay on this diagonal, it's important. The idea of the black player now is to play f4. After that happens, it's going to be very easy to end this game. And if f3 happens by white, first of all, okay, then you play a3 anyway, and you're producing a passed pawn. In this position, what happens after the bishop goes back to a4? Okay, bishop to d6, and after castle, c3, in order to allow the bishop to go to this other diagonal as well. h6, attacking the knight, knight f3, e4, right? You see how these patterns, you're going to memorize them and you're going to be able to know exactly what to do each time in each and every setup. This is so thematic. Knight to d4, and now c5, we attack the knight's got nowhere really to go. Let's say knight to b5, attacking the bishop. Black plays surprisingly, well, not really surprisingly, knight to g4 with an idea of allowing the pieces to go for this square. And now knight d6 just gives black a tremendous initiative. If h3, Surprisingly, in this time, this is really surprising, bishop to h2 check, which is weird because after king to h1, we can't really remove the knight without losing the bishop. But black now plays the winning move, bishop to b7. Boom, my favorite move in this position. Obviously, you can give up this knight because then queen to h4, you threaten discover attack, which is checkmate to follow. Knight to d2 by white, all of the best moves by white, none of them will work. e3, this is so aggressive. Taking here will allow the knight to take back with an attack on the rook, the queen, and the g2 square with the threat of just destroying everything. White playing knight to e4 now. This will be the only idea, because if you take with the pawn and you think you go up a piece, then you see the queen can take the knight in g4. So the best move by black is queen to h4, and after bishop taking in e3, it looks like the white player has been able to defend himself successfully. However, knight takes, pawn takes back, and now bishop to g3. Now we do have an attack over the knight in e4, but the best move by white is b4, attacking our knight. So we take, white takes, and now rook takes, queen takes. All of these moves are forced, and now we take the pawn in d3. And remember, the queen cannot take the pawn in d3. Now we are threatening. Now that the bishop is released on this diagonal, the knight is no longer there. We are threatening queen takes pawn, checkmate to follow. The pawn in g2 is pinned. So we're going to close it in this position. One more thing that has to be said in this variation of the bishop a4 is that after h6, the knight doesn't have to go to f3. There's another move that could be an idea. It's b4. It looks like, if we take the knight and we help the bishop develop, pinning our knight, and I have encountered this move a lot. What to do? We take the knight, okay? We don't care about that because after pawn takes back the piece, now we play g4. Yeah, the bishop can still come there, but it's not a problem. We have a massive attack going on the king side. Bishop to c6 doesn't work to attack a rook because you just played rook to b8, and that's just fine. After bishop to e3, attacking this pawn and threatening to trap the rook. How to respond to this? Queen to c7, attacking the bishop as well, and after the bishop moves back to the only available square, king to h8 is the best move, prophylactic move. I mean, the bishop was going to go to b3, almost certainly. f3 by white. How to respond to this threat? Obviously, if we take, white wants to develop the pieces, and then the queen on this file might be dangerous. Black plays e4. So that's the move to remember. I mean, look at this. We have an attack on h2. If white plays f4 with the idea of stopping that attack, then knight to d5 is too strong to meet. We're going to have too much pressure on the f4 pawn. We also have an attack on the bishop, so we're winning material. And if the pawn takes in e4 and opening the queen file, what we take in h2, check, king h1, and now knight to h5 is the best move. We have very strong threats like knight to g3, winning everything. Or simply, if bishop f2, you also have the same threat of knight g3, bishop takes, queen takes, and then you can retreat the queen and prepare discover checks. White has got nothing going on. Your king is actually safe. The last line we're going to look at before we can say that we can understand the Italian with bishop d3 very well. f5 and d3. Knight f6, we went through bishop g5, knight g5, knight c3. What happens after the immediate castle? Okay, surprisingly, bishop b4 comes anyway, so that if the knight comes, you already know what to do. Now, the knight doesn't have to come, but let's say it does. Okay, we go on with bishop takes, pawn takes, and now we take this pawn. Pawn takes, d6. Pawn is safe here, and we have created this long-term weakness. a4 is met with queen to e7. That's how the setup will look like. Let's look at this idea. Rook b1 preventing our bishop from developing. We just take this pawn. It's safe to be taken. So in case they ignore that, in case they don't play rook e1, feel free to take this pawn without fear of strong attack coming from white. Rook e1 cannot happen because 3 wins the game, or wins just too much material. So if queen to e1 attacking the knight and protecting c3, the knight goes back to f6, and after bishop to g5, pinning the knight. Knight goes to a5, attacking the bishop, thematic, and after bishop a2, white is keeping the strongest piece he has. Well, b6 comes for black. We're going to be fianchettoing the bishop, also because bishop g4, we wouldn't be pinning anything. After knight to d2, looks like the knight might be able to go and put more pressure over the knight in f6, which could be annoying. But now bishop to a6, attacking the rook. So after c4, stopping that for the moment. Black plays long castle. We're completely safe in here, even though it doesn't really look like, but we are. Knight to e4 comes now, putting a lot of pressure on the knight. We don't have much to worry because we also have a pawn defending here. So we attack the bishop. And after the bishop goes back, keeping the pin, we keep pushing, and we are no longer being pinned. Bishop g3, and now we can take the pawn in c4. And black is better even in this variation. So from the start, when we get to the immediate castling move, we mentioned that we have to play bishop to b4. And obviously knight c3 is not a good idea. What happens if knight to d2 to develop? Okay, well, we take this pawn no matter what. And after the pawn takes back, bishop goes back to c5. We don't have to worry about the bishop in c5. It's very well placed because the knight in c3 will be a problem, because the knight in c3 will be able to play knight a4, attack c5 and b6. We're going to be giving either the bishop pair, or we're going to have to retreat the bishop all the way back and admit wasting tempos. So here you can play bishop c5. After rook to e1, d6, knight to f1, the white player is preparing to play the thematic typical ideas of the Italian game, knight g3 and knight f5. Black plays knight to e5, attacking the bishop, and after the bishop goes back to d3, avoiding the swap, which would be completely non-beneficial as we all know. Castle, and now knight to g3, king to h8. It looks like white is fine. Knight to f5. We've seen this before, but now knight to e4. This is a tactic, so that cannot happen. Bishop takes back. We want a pawn. And now after a3, the idea of playing b4 with a fork. The bishop takes the bishop. Rook takes back. Also because we had double attack. So b4 had to wait. We had double attack over the knight in f3. We would have messed up everything. Rook takes, and now the knight goes back to c6. There's nothing, okay? Pawn b4, bishop b6, bishop to b2. Looks like white might have some compensation for the lost pawn, but now a5, thematic move. We want to start developing this rook. We also want to start swapping stuff. b5 now attacking the knight is met by knight to b8. It's not a problem because you can place the knight back into very good square, d7 and then f6, since the other knight, the f6 knight is gone. Knight b8, and now queen d2 developing, knight to d7. We're doing just so much better. After rook e2, these are best moves by white. So here, if white plays queen to g5, that's a blunder because bishop takes with check. We're winning another pawn. If king takes, then the queen will be free since the knight is pinned. If rook goes to e2 to give extra support to the f2 square, knight to c5 is the best move. And now after queen to g5 idea, you can take. Knight takes back, and now simply kick the knight away. This knight, don't let this knight scare you. The knight g5 move in the Italian game, don't let them ever scare you. Knight to f3, and now knight to a4, attacking the fianchettoed bishop. The bishop's got really nowhere to go except c1. But then you can play knight c3, the idea of pushing the e3 pawn, e4 pawn. The knight has to move. You're attacking the rook as well. The rook will have to move. You're going to have a lot of pressure over f2. It's not worth it. You can also push e3 later on. So after c4, knight takes, rook takes. Now e4 comes. And white position gets too passive. So back in this position, white just castle, we just played bishop b4, and we went through knight c3, knight d2. Okay, so what happens after c3? This looks more logical. Okay, so what to do in this position? We take the pawn. We ignore the piece being attacked because we're attacking the knight in f3. So pawn takes bishop, we take the knight. And after queen takes back, d5, black has now a better center than white. So after bishop goes back to b3, we can castle. And after bishop to g5, putting pressure over f6, it's not a problem because we don't have a f pawn anymore, right? So we can take back with the queen, with the rook, improving the position of our pieces, no matter the swaps. However, you can argue that white is also pressuring the knight and pinning the knight so that there's an attack on d5. White will have 2 pieces attacking that square. Okay, black plays knight to d4 now, attacking these two. And white can't really take the knight with an attack on our queen because we will be taking the queen with check. So after queen to e3, queen to d6, I'm pinning the knight. And after rook to e1, knight goes now to g4, attacking the queen. Queen to g3, and now rook takes in f2 is the final blow. The queen can't take back, of course. So after h3, it looks like our knight is being attacked, and after moving, we will lose the rook. So we're in a bit of trouble. What to do here? Rook to f5. Remember, when you're about to lose a piece, just play a desperate move where you attack an opponent piece, and this is the best move in the position. After the bishop moves back to d2, saving the bishop pair. That was the best chance by white, unless white wanted to double up and isolate the pawns in front of his own king and allow the rook to be on the same file of the queen and rook and king. Knight to f6 comes now, and you can see how misplaced white pieces are and how ugly the pawn structure is of the white player. After knight c3 developing, bishop to e6, we're ready to bring all the pieces into the game. Rook a to c1, getting the rook on an open file. Knight goes to h5, attacking the queen. Queen to h2. White pieces are pathetic. Rook a to f8, development is complete. And we're going to stop the line here after rook to f1. Queen to b6 is the best move. King can't move because we have too much attack over the pawn of the rooks. And obviously bishop e3, I'm pinning. Getting rid of the very strong discover check idea is met by rook takes back, and now knight e2 is checkmate to follow very soon. Or at least black would win just so much material, because you see, if the knight takes the knight, then you can take the bishop with check, king moves, and then you're going down here with the rook. Knight blocks, and then you got this knight check. So back in this position, by the way, we went through b3. What happens after bishop to b5? Black will castle, getting rid of the annoying pin, because this stopped our knight from going to the very ideal d4 square. Remember, in this variation where they play c3 and we give up the bishop, white is the one that ruins the pawn structure. So that's why white shouldn't play c3. And now, if white plays bishop to g5, then this should make it clear that knight to d4 is the best move in the position and wins the game on the spot. If bishop takes the knight first, we take back, obviously. And now, after bishop to g5, bishop to a6, threatening this isolated pawn, which is a target. After knight to c3, black plays e4. And the pawn is pinned, so can't take. Neither can the knight or the queen. And we're going to win that pawn. Well, we are going to win material. If bishop takes desperate for swap, just take with the rook, so you're still keeping the threats. And yeah, black will go up material.